this is James Lawler and welcome to the Squawk Point. What I'm going to do in this video is talk you through how to set up your own process improvement workshop. Now there are 4 things really that you need to do. First thing is you obviously need to get yourself set up for one. So I'll talk through the setup and how you do that. Then the second thing you do is you work through what your current process is, so you understand how it looks currently. After that, you then go into your redesign. So how do you redesign it? What are the rules? How do you go about that? And then finally, how do you present that back and how do you get agreements to what you want to do? So those are the 4 stages, and we'll plug on and start to talk about the first one. How do you get started? What's the setup? Okay, so which process are you going to fix? Now, clearly you need to have a problem. That's really important. There's no point just fixing things if you don't have a problem. So what is the problem and who thinks you've got a problem? Now, if you think of a process, well, if you think of project management, project managers will always talk to you about getting things done to time, to quality, and also to cost. And there are fundamentally 3 variables that they worry about. And actually, processes are very similar because you're producing something in the way you do with a project. So it's all about time, quality, and cost. So if you've got a problem, ultimately, you're either going to be too slow, not giving customers what they want when they want it, your quality is going to be rubbish, or, excuse me, it's going to be too expensive. And being really clear about which of those is the problem, first up, is really important. Then, of course, who worries about that? So who fundamentally thinks you've got a problem? Is it somebody in the organisation? Is it the customer? So being really clear about who thinks there's a problem or what it is fundamentally important. Next thing is, well, does the data support that? So just because somebody thinks there's a problem doesn't necessarily mean there is a problem, and you can chase your tail for a long time. So getting clear on the data, seeing what measures you've got, can you substantiate what the issue is? Because once you've got that, it may well point you in a slightly different position or a different direction. Now, once you've established that there is a problem and data supports it, then the really important question is, well, what is the purpose of your process? And that sounds a bit strange, but all processes produce things. They've got a purpose. They deliver something. And being really clear up front about what it is that the process is going to deliver is fundamentally important. And we'll talk about that a little later. And then another variable is, where does your process start and finish? Which sounds a bit strange. But if you think, for example, maybe something as easy as a recruitment process, well, does that start when somebody hands in their notice and you've got a vacancy? Or does that start when somebody fills in a form? Or does that start when you actually brief your recruiter? And likewise, when you think about the end of a recruitment process, is that when you've made a job offer? Or is that on somebody's first day? Or is it after they've passed their 3-month probation period? So being really clear about where things start and stop is fundamentally important. And then just one final point I'd like to make is that not all processes are equal. So if you imagine that you have a process for cleaning the toilets, the washrooms, then if you run a fast food chain, McDonald's or something like that, then making sure that those things are spotless is really critical to your business. Whereas if you work in a bank and you're talking about your staff loos, okay, they need to be clean, but it's not quite in the same vein, is it? Or not the same level of importance. So being really clear about how important this thing to you is really important. So that's the first thing, getting really clear about what your process is. So now you've established what the problem is and what the processes you're going to work on, the next question is who needs to work on it with you? Now there are 6 groups of people you need to think about. The first and probably the most important are the people who work with a process every day. So the people who actually do the work. You don't necessarily want the managers. They might think they know what they're talking about, but invariably they're kidding themselves. You want the people who actually do the work on a day-to-day basis. So that's your first group. The second group, oddly, is your customers. So who are you actually providing this output to, and what do they think about it? And what feedback have they got? So having those guys involved is really important. And the third group actually is the suppliers. Now sometimes your customers and your suppliers are one and the same people because it might be that they make a request and that kicks the whole thing off. But who else is involved in providing you with the information or the raw materials or whatever it is that you need for your process to work properly, and how can you get those guys engaged? The next group is really any influential opinion formers. So for example, maybe you have an auditor who is got a bee in his bonnet about your process, Or maybe there are some people who management information or reporting stuff and it's making things look worse than they really are, or whatever it might be. But who are those influential people who you need to get on side and who need to understand what's going on? Next, unless you can have project manager the outcome of this yourself, you really do need to have a project manager involved. Because at the end of your workshop, you'll end up with a redesigned process and a whole string of actions that need to be done. And of course, that's worthless unless they actually get done. So project management is a skill, and making sure you've got a real project manager on the hook to deliver it is really important. And then finally, and probably most important of all, is you need a sponsor. So who really cares? Who's prepared to knock over the barriers for you and get rid of the obstacles? And that's the final person that you need to have involved in your workshop. Okay, the third thing you need to do, once you're clear about what your process is that you're going to fix and also who needs to be involved, is sit down and brief your sponsor. Have a conversation with them about what you need from them and what you plan to do. The first thing, obviously, is just to sit down and make sure that you're in agreement what the problem is that you're going to fix. Do they really buy that? Is that the issue as they see it? Because clearly, if you're going to fix something that they don't want fixed, you're going to struggle to get their sponsorship. So that agreement is all important. Okay, the next thing they're going to have to do is supply you with the resources that you need. So you're going to need some facilities, a room or something like that. You're going to need some members of his staff, and also you're going to need their time. So making sure that your sponsor is agreeable to that and lined up to help provide those things is really quite important. Otherwise, there's not a huge amount of point starting your exercise. Your sponsor will also be actually involved in your improvement process. So right at the end of the session, and we'll talk about this later, but you'll want to present back to the sponsor and debrief them about what it is exactly you want them to do. And you'll also want them to agree or disagree to what your proposal is. But that needs to be done there and then. So the sponsor will have an active part to play at the end of your session in being presented back to. And then obviously the final thing your sponsor will need to do is provide ongoing support. So just as you'll need a project manager to manage these things through, your sponsor will need to make sure they get done as right. Once you've briefed your sponsor, the next thing you need to do is brief your attendees. They need to understand what's going on, what are you going to use their time for. So the first thing is actually what's the aim, right? So get the guys in a room, sit them down for an hour, half an hour or so, and say, well, this is what we're trying to achieve, and get them to buy into that aim. Get their understanding, their beliefs, whatever it is they think, get that out on the table first. Once you're all agreed on that, then the next thing is they're going to have to put some time into this. So your workshop, depending on how complicated things are, will take between 1 and 2 days. But they need to commit 1 or 2 days out of their diaries. I'm sure they're busy people. So you need to explain that, but also it's worth pointing out that you will do it as quickly as you can and you won't waste their time. So I often find that if you say you're going to finish early, if you get the opportunity to finish early, that goes down well. How long it will actually take, as I actually said, depends on what it is that you're trying to fix, but you'll get a sense of that with experience. So the next thing you do is walk them through what the process is actually going to entail. So how are you going to solve the problem, and you walk them through the actual couple of days that you're going to spend with them so they feel comfortable about it. And obviously after that, they'll have to make some commitments because the work needs to be done, the job needs to be improved, and the guys who are in the workshop will be large part involved in that. So they need to know that up front and feel comfortable with that. And then the final thing, and this is really important, is get their feedback about what you've missed. So I don't know, if Fred from engineering needs to be actively involved in the session, and you haven't thought about Fred in engineering, then the guys should point that out to you. So get them to tell you what you've missed and what are the things you need to think about, and then cover those off before you actually run the session. And that's the purpose of your intent debriefing session. Okay, now you've got everybody lined up, it's just worth thinking about the logistics a little bit, because it's mundane, but you don't want it all to come round your ears because you haven't sorted that out. So the first thing you'll need is the big room, somewhere where you can put a lot of brown paper on the wall, because you guessed it, it's going to involve brown paper, this exercise. And somewhere that's comfortable, because they're going to be locked away in there for a couple of days. So ideally somewhere where it's nice and cool and bright. Next, brown paper, lots of it. You can get it cheap, get a roll full of it, you'll need that. You'll also need flip charts and marker pens, and you'll need post-it notes. You need quite a lot of post-it notes. And you'll probably need them in 2 colours as well, maybe a normal yellow and a bright pink or something like that. And the final thing, and you really do need to get this because it's particularly important, is you need to lay on some tea and biscuits, because if you've got them locked in a room for a couple of days, they are going to get a bit frustrated if you're not feeding and watering them. So that's the logistics of the whole thing sorted out. Those are the facilities you need. And the final thing you need to do is just make yourself familiar with what you can lay your hands on already, so that you're not walking into your session blind. So if you can, go and spend some time observing the process. Go and work out what actually happens. Sit there, listen to people, talk to people, get an understanding of what it's all about. That'll make your life ever so much easier. The second thing is, if there's any existing process documentation, if somebody's written it down, lay your hands on copies of that. And people will want you to have it anyway. It's usually quite useful to you because you have something they can refer back to. And the final thing is, if there is some data, I don't know, throughput rates or costs or quality or service or whatever it is, but lay your hands on whatever data there is that's already available. So there you have it. Those are the 6 things you need to worry about when you're setting up a session. The first one is being really clear what the problem is you're trying to fix and which process you're talking about and what the scope of that is. The second thing is being clear about who you need to have involved in your session, and then making sure that your sponsor is agreeable to it, because without that you really are trying to, it's like shoveling fog. And also making sure that the attendees are warmed up beforehand. It's not supposed to be some sort of surprise exercise. Once you've got all of that, make sure you've got the facilities that you need and a little bit of prep, making yourself familiar with what's going on. And when you've done all of that, then you're ready to start your process improvement workshop. The first part of your process improvement workshop, and arguably about half the time you're going to spend on the whole thing, is really understanding how things work now. So getting a sound understanding and getting everybody else agreed that this is roughly how things work now. And there are 4 parts to that. First thing is, you'll understand the scope of what you're trying to do and make sure everybody's agreed on that. Once you've done that, you'll then go into actually drafting out how the process works, so the old flow mapping parts. Flow charting, I should say. Once you've done that, then you start to identify all the things that could be done better in there. And then the final thing, the 4th thing you'll do in this section, is just look at what the constraints are. So why is it that the process is the way that it is? And are there any constraints you'll have to move as well if you want to improve it? So right at the beginning of your workshop, if you can, the first thing to do is just go through the scope of what you're trying to do. And if you can get your sponsor to come in at that point and give them 10 minutes on why this is important, why it's important to him, why it's important to the organisation, what you're trying to achieve, that's really powerful, because it's not just about you facilitating a session, it's something that the sponsor wants, and that will help no end. Once that person's gone, then there are 2 things you really need to nail, and we talked about them already, but you need to get everybody lined up to start off with. First of all, what's the purpose of the process? So what are you trying to achieve with this process? Because if they all see it slightly differently and can't agree what that purpose is, then you'll get into a hell of a mess. So take the time to make sure that that's written down, wordsmith it a little bit, but try and get it down to 1 sentence, whatever that may be. The purpose of this process is to recruit the best caliber employees for this organisation, for example. Or the purpose of this process is to make sure that we deliver a management information report on time every month. Or whatever it may be. But you'll need that purpose statement later on, so spend the time to get everybody agreed and write it down, and try to remove as much of the management speak as you can, because it's just vague, doesn't necessarily help. And once you've got that nailed down, then the second thing is you need them to agree on what the start and end points are. Now I talked about that a little bit earlier on, but getting that nailed down and everybody agreed in the workshop so everyone's there and also written down is really going to be fundamental to the success of what you're trying to do. So that's the start of your session, really working out the scope of what you're trying to do. Okay, once you've done that, now you're into the bulk of what you've got to do on the first day, and that really is to flesh out the process as it currently is, so write down a flow chart. So you start with the first thing. You've agreed what your starting point is, you've already written that down, so get a post-it note, write on that post-it note what the first point is, and then you simply ask, what happens next? And you just go through the whole exercise, post-it note after post-it note, clarifying, working your way along the piece of brown paper to work out what happens next. Now there are a number of tricks of the trade which you should be aware of. You'll be surprised, but everyone will see it slightly differently because it's probably not written down somewhere, or if it is, nobody's paying any attention. So when you get to a disagreement, make sure you capture the disagreement to make so that people realise that you're listening and it's been recognised. Write it on a flip chart somewhere, and then leave it there and come back to it, because invariably the disagreements aren't really worth that much in the end with hindsight, but make sure you do come back to that. The second thing is always start with the biggest things first. So for example, if your process is to make fast food and you've got a store which supplies hot dogs and supplies hamburgers, then which do you do most of, hamburgers or hot dogs? And start with that one, because that gives you somewhere to work with. But invariably, if you start with the hamburgers and then you go back to the hot dogs, they'll be pretty much the same, but it just gives you a way to start the ball rolling. And then the final thing is, as you go along the process, you'll invariably come to it depends moments, where there's decision and processes branch off. So when that happens, just make a little mark, stick up a blank post-it, whatever it is that works for you, so that you know when to come back to your decision points and make sure that you don't miss anything. But the end of this is not an exercise in perfection. It really is just to get everybody into the same place in terms of understanding of what happens next. And that will be your initial they call it an as-is process web. How does it work now? Okay, once you've done that, the next job is to highlight all the bits which could work better. So process improvement is really easy. All you do is fix the things that don't work too well. So the way in which you do that is you give the guys red pens or different colour post-it note or whatever it is, and you get them to go over the process flow map as you put it up and highlight all the areas where things could work better than they currently do. And the standard you should use at this point is perfection, because what you're trying to do is get people to realise that things could be better. Now, I have run sessions where the whole flow map looks like it's got a bad rash within 30 seconds. And I've also run sessions where everybody thinks, well, this is all good and we're doing it for a valid reason. So if you come to that situation, ask the guys what perfection would look like, and is this process step really perfect or not, because that's the standard you need to measure yourself by. If you've read anything about lean thinking, and there's a link below that you can use to look at that, they will talk about different types of waste. Waste being stuff which is not done as well as it could be. And there are, depending on who you talk to, 7 or 8 different types. But that's a way you can look at it which might help. So the first of these is transport. So transport's about moving goods or information or data. So are you moving stuff about that you don't need to move about that's not helpful? So for example, if you're batching stuff up and sending it to India, then that's transportation waste. The next one is intellect. So are you wasting people's brains? Are you wasting their intellect? You maybe have experienced that in your own job, but the classic one, I worked with a firm in London for a while, and they used to hire graduates and put them into administration positions. And these guys were bored out of their tiny minds, but it was a high-profile firm and they could do that. So it was just a waste of intellect. The next type of waste is motion. Motion in this instance, it refers to people motion rather than transporting goods. So if you have to get up and walk to a photocopier and the photocopier is the other side of the building, that's people motion. If you find yourself cutting and pasting stuff over and over and over again from one database to another database, that's people motion. Waiting is the fourth. So waiting is just, do you as an employee have to wait for stuff, or are customers having to wait for stuff? So where's the time spent? Where are you waiting for things? Why aren't things happening straight away? After that, you've got over-processing. So what over-processing is building in more than you really need or more than the customer's prepared to pay for. So if you think of quality control, so invariably you've got quality control. I've got some thoughts about that, but we'll move on. But if you've got people quality controlling the quality controllers, then there is no doubt about it. That is over-processing. You're doing too much. Think of it as like going to buy a cake from a shop. If they put it in a fancy little tray, and then they put that tray in a fancy little wrapper, and then they put that fancy little wrapper in a bag, and then they put that bag in a box, and then they put a ribbon around the box, and you get outside the shop and then you eat the cake, then they've over-processed it. There's more packaging than you want. The next one's overproduction. So overproduction is making more of what you need making more than you really need. And people often do this because it's cheap. So for example, you might be selling or making marketing brochures. So you create the brochure and then you go and you look to see how many you can order, and the minimum batch size is, 10,000 of these things. So you go off and you order 10,000 of these things, when the reality is you only need 1,000 of them, and then 9,000 of them just sitting on a shelf for a year or so, and then you've changed your brand and then they just get pulped. So that's overproduction, making more than you really need. Next one, defects. I think that's fairly straightforward. That's where just things gone wrong, things which you need to rework. And then the final one, and this links to some of the other ones, is stock. So if you've done overproduction, you've made stuff, then you just have a pile of stock that nobody wants. And you end up paying to store that stock. But also it might cost you because people are waiting, because you have to work through the stock before you can change anything. So you can see how these things all tie together. It's not important which type of waste you talk about and getting it precise. It's just understanding that there are opportunities to improve. And that's the whole key to the exercise. So with a bit of luck, once you've gone through that and taught through your process map, as I said, you'll have a process map that looks like it's got a bad case of the measles, with opportunities to improve it all over. Now the final thing you need to do, and then that's call it quits for the day if you like, is highlight the reasons why you've got all this waste. So processes don't exist in a vacuum, they exist in part of an organisational context. And there will be reasons why the process has been designed the way it has been. So a classic one is targets. So if people have been given specific targets that they need to meet, then they'll design the process to meet those targets, and that may not be necessarily the best way to do things. Another one will be bonuses, which are kind of links, but a target with a nice big heavy bonus behind it won't half help make sure that people do things to hit the bonus rather than the smoothest way to deliver the process. An example of that, I once worked on a training program, and the process for delivering new training materials, they wanted one of these computer-based training things, and there was a girl in an office, and what she did was she said she had a service level agreement and she would load the stuff up once a fortnight. So she batched everything up and loads it up once a fortnight because it was really efficient for her. Of course, what that meant was that the whole process took 2 weeks longer than it needed to, so with all the cost and missed opportunity, but that was because the girl was targeted on being as efficient as she could. So that's what I mean by those type of organisational concepts. The other thing is, are there any specific functional requirements? So I talked about audit earlier on, well that might drive some strange behaviour, but what is the function trying to do? If they're trying to be a centre of excellence, what does that mean, and is that really helping anybody else? So what are those functional drivers and objectives? And once you've got those three things, write them down, highlight them on the map, and show how they are messing things about. And that's it for the day. You should have by now a process map with a rash of opportunities on it, and then some of the key things which are driving it to be the way it is. And at that point, I'd stop for the day and I'd adjourn to the pub myself, but whatever takes your boat, and start again the following day. So now you're into the redesign exercise. There are 3 bits to this. First thing is the cardinal rule, right? So how are you going to know that your process is better than it used to be? What's the cardinal design rule you need to follow? Then you'll have a blank sheet of paper. How do you work with that? And the third thing I'll talk to you about is just comparing the before and after. So how will you be able to demonstrate that it is a better process? Okay, so what's the cardinal rule? What's the one thing you need to remember? And that's really simple and it's blindingly obvious, but processes produce things for customers. So only a customer can tell you whether it's good process or not. The people who are working on the process, what they want is a little bit irrelevant. The whole idea of a good process is to give the customer what they want with the least fuss and as quickly as possible, best quality. So when you're redesigning your process, you have to keep referring back to the purpose, what you're there to do, and keep asking yourself, is this going to give the customer that output in the best way possible? And it really is as simple as that. If you design your process to be cheap, and you can do that, you can break it up, you can put handoffs in, you can outsource bits, you can do all sorts of things to make it cheap. But if you go at it from the perspective of making it cheap, all you're going to end up with is something that's nasty, frankly, and you'll end up with a bunch of unhappy customers, so it won't be that cheap in the long run. So the cheapest place is where the customer gets exactly what they're expecting when they want it and what they've signed up for. So take that approach. Is this going to give the customer what the customer wants? Okay, now you're into the actual redesign. So you start off with a blank piece of paper, and you'll start up, you put up a post-it note, and you'll say what happens first, and with luck it'll be the same trigger point. Your process will start with the same thing. So that's nice and clear. And then you ask, what happens next? And how do you want it to be? And those are kind of simply how it works. Get everybody engaged, get everybody talking about it. As you go through, you will find out that there are potential to end up in a load of rabbit warrens. So it's really important that you clarify the principles and don't worry too much about how it's done. So one of the things might be we need a form that captures down all the requirements for this recruitment process, because we don't have that properly. So the trick is to have a form. Whether that form is web enabled or on a spreadsheet or written by pen and quill really doesn't matter that much. The point is you need a form. So try and stick to the principles and get that, and let people work out the details later. So there's the first thing. The second thing is each step, and I've said it, but remember the cardinal rule, does this step contribute towards the purpose that you talked about? Because if it does, then you're okay, but if it doesn't, then it's going to be suboptimal. So just remember the cardinal rule. You will have disagreements. You handle the disagreements exactly the same way. Write them on your parking lot. Yeah. And then move on, and then come back to it. Make sure you do come back to your list of disagreements, but invariably these things are storms in a teacup and aren't that important. So that's the way to deal with them. Of course, the final thing is as you move along, you'll have clear actions and owners, so get somebody to scribe those down on a flip chart as well as you move along. So at the end of this, you'll end up with a process map and a clear list of actions and owners that you need to implement to get that new process to be the way you want it to be. So now you've redesigned your process, it's always a good idea to be sure that you understand why it's a better process. The way to do that is just note down a couple of differences. So the first thing is how many steps are there? What's the difference in total number of steps? Next thing is look at handoff. So wherever you have a handoff, you've got the opportunity to mess things up. So if you've reduced handoffs, you'll be in a better place, and that's something that's really worth doing. After the handoffs, another really good trick is just to write down the amount of time that it will take from start to end of the process. And the way to do that is to look at each step individually and say, well, how long does this step in its own right take? And also, how long is the time between steps? Because if you've redesigned your process better, you'll have fewer handoffs, and the time between steps will be dramatically quicker. And then the final thing is areas where you can have defects. So highlight on your previous process map where the defects are, and then on your new process map where your opportunities are. And across those four measures, if you like, you should be able to see some clear improvements. Make a note of that, because that'll come in really handy to you for the last stage, which is your presentation back to your sponsor and getting agreement for what you need to do next. Now you're into the final bit of the whole thing, which is getting agreement. How are you going to get your sponsor to agree to these changes that you're proposing? And there's quite a defined agenda that I'll talk you through, because there is a way to do this which makes your life ever so much easier. Bring the sponsor back into the room and get the guys who have actually done the redesign to present to the sponsor. You don't want to be doing this. You want them to own it and it be their issue that they're trying to fix. So get them to practice beforehand and then run through the agenda. And what that agenda is first of all, talk about the purpose of the process, the problem that you're trying to fix, and the scope. Because that will just make sure that your sponsor is lined up with everything that you're going to say. And you have it all written down already, so it's no hardship, but that's really important. Once you've done that, the second thing to do is talk through the process as it currently is. You have a nice little visual game here because you have all that rash of coloured post-it notes all over it, showing the areas for improvement. So instantly he'll realise or she'll realise that there's an opportunity there. But don't talk them through the entire process. Once you've gone through it, there will be 4 or 5 things which fundamentally need to be fixed. They'll be the big things. So make sure that somebody realises what those 4 or 5 things are and get them to talk through those. So the sponsor's got it clear in their minds what the big levers are that need to be pulled to make things better. Once you've done that, bring up the next person and get that person to talk through the proposed improvements. So look at the new process map, and obviously it will look shorter, so it will look better to start off with. But then talk through, go back to your 4 or 5 key things and make sure you hammer home the point, what needs to be done to improve those 4 or 5 key things, so the sponsor's really clear. And there's nothing stopping you scribbling on your post-it, on your work, on your brown paper, and actually highlighting where those 4 or 5 things are, so it's really, really clear. Then it's worth going through those measures that you talked through, so you can do a before and after. What's the difference in time it's going to take? What's the difference in terms of the amount of defects you're going to get? So go through that, and then talk through what you need. So what's the sponsor got to give you that will help you get what you need to deliver your improved process? So now you've got to the point where it's clear what you need to do, what resources you'll need, and then the final thing you want is you want agreement. So ask your sponsor there and then if they're happy to proceed. And you need to brief the sponsor that this is going to happen beforehand so they're not caught cold. But it can be a real damp squib if you walk out of the session and nothing's agreed. So the sponsor might want to do all of it, think it's great, or for some reason something else might be happening, he'll only want to do half of it, or it might be that he doesn't want to do it at all, in which case it's best to get that out in the open there and then. And that's it. Simple as that. Once your sponsor's decided what's going to happen, that's the end of your session. You will have a redesign process, you will have a list of actions, you'll have some clear measures of why it will be better, and the next thing to do is crack on and make sure that changes happen, which is why, as I said, you needed that project manager. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't bang on too much, and that's how you do it. There are a number of links below to bits and pieces which might be able to help you as well, and also I've printed out these slides as a PDF so you can lay your hands on those as well. I would urge you just to crack on and have a go. That's the trick to learning how to do these things. Good luck.